Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Kavli conversation on science communication. My name is Dan Fagan, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program at NYU, and also the Science Communication Workshops at NYU. And we are really interested in all forms of nonfiction storytelling. We want to work on traditional stuff, and we also want to explore new ideas. And today is more in the latter category. Not that animation is a new idea, it's very old. But the people that you're going to meet today are doing it in really interesting and successful ways. So I'm super excited about that. Before I introduce Anna and turn things over to her, just a couple of quick ground rules. We're actually not going to use the chat box. We're going to use the Q&A box on Zoom. So if you have a question, and we hope you will have questions, put it click on that little Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and Anna will see it and find a way, hopefully, to work your question into the conversation. And our panelists may also be willing to respond directly in the Q&A, which they're welcome to do just by typing. Anyway, lots of good options. It's a pleasure to introduce my former student and friend, Anna Rothschild, who is a science presenter, a video producer, and a journalist. Probably should have said journalist first. She's currently the senior video producer at 538, where she hosts Podcast 19, which is, of course, about COVID-19. Previously, she was the on-air science host for the Washington Post, where she launched the Post's variety show, Science Magic Show Hooray, which is hilarious and fun and totally entertaining. You can still see it. Before that, she was the creator, host, and animator of Gross Science, which I thought was just fantastic. And it also lives on. You can find it on YouTube. She did that with Nova and PBS Digital Studios. Anna is just really a super creative, interesting person and a terrific journalist. And it's an honor to have her here, and also to say that she's going to be hosting some additional Kavli conversations, we hope, for a long time, along with Molly Webster. And we're going to have another one of these soon, in 2 or 3 weeks. We don't have a specific date yet, but you can always go to journalism.nyu.edu/KC to see what we have coming up. And that same address is also where you can watch this conversation, an archived version starting tomorrow. So with that, I will stop talking and shut off my screen so as not to distract everyone, and turn it over to the professionals, starting with Anna. So take it away, Anna.
Thank you so much, Dan. As I put in the chat, I am completely blushing now. So thank you for that introduction. I'm really, really happy to be hosting these Kavli conversations along with Molly. And this is the perfect one to start with. We are here with 3 amazing guests, 3 people who I know and have admired for a really long time, who are each in the world of animation and have very different approaches to it, and sort of different skills and talents. So I think it's going to be, I'm excited to learn from all 3 of you, and I think it's going to be a good talk. So with me today are first, Sabrina Cruz. She's the editor-in-chief and co-host of the YouTube channel Answer in Progress. I've been following Sabrina for a really long time. She started making videos and motion graphics actually when she was still a student. And she's written and hosted a variety of educational series. Answer in Progress is really cool because she and her co-hosts, each episode, they ask a different question, and basically leave no stone unturned until they exhaustively answer that question for themselves. And often that actually means learning a new skill, which is really awesome. Next, we have Vanessa Hill. She is a video producer, science communicator, animator, and host. She's currently getting her PhD. She studies the science of sleep. She is probably best known for her YouTube channel, Braincraft, where she does stop motion animation and excellent presentation and motion graphics to talk about everything that has to do with neuroscience and psychology. She's also the creator of the YouTube original special, Sleeping with Friends, and she's produced documentaries for places like ABC Australia. She basically has done everything in the world of animation. She does stop motion and motion graphics, but also has directed animators for small projects and high budget projects. Thank you for being here, Vanessa. And finally, Alex Rosenthal is the editorial director of TED Animations. Animation is basically what TED is famous for. They have a giant library made up of collaborations between writers and experts in their fields and animators. And Alex kind of sits at the center of it all and has produced, hundreds of animated videos. Before joining TED, he worked for the Science Show Nova, where I first met him. And we developed our love of cryptic crossword puzzles together. And he also has produced documentaries for places like National Geographic. So Alex, Sabrina, and Vanessa, thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to chat with the three of you.
Thanks, Anna. It's exciting to be here too.
Woo! So to get started, one thing that's really interesting about all three of you is that you all have backgrounds in STEM, or in some cases, actually in science communication specifically, but you've all ended up in the world of animation. So what drew you to animation as a storytelling device? Sabrina, do you want to go first? Was that me or I'm not me?
It could be both, but I guess it'll be me. Yeah, so I started off with I was very much animation first, STEM second, but my family wasn't super big into film school or animation school, so I studied STEM. Yeah, but I've always had a passion for like animation, animated storytelling. And then I studied math in university. I played around a lot with science communication and making videos. And when I've stumbled into like this current format, this current part of my career with Answer in Progress, what we found was with the format that we wanted to make, we wanted it to be very personality driven while also having that educational spin to it. And we really relied on animation to really provide that zhuzh, that like fanciness, that little impressive production quality that really separated us from other people who might just be vlogging, talking to a camera, saying really interesting things, but not necessarily communicating them clearly or really justifying the production in that time. It really like levels up the information that you're trying to portray with animation. Forgot the exact word I wanted, and so I gave you a paragraph.
I'll always take a paragraph from you, Sabrina. Vanessa, Alex?
Certainly. I think for me, I was drawn to animation because I've just always been a very visual person. Like I've always been doodling and drawing things and decorating cakes and kind of doing things crafty. And when I started my YouTube channel, I also didn't want my face to be on screen. I really wanted to put the science front and center rather than doing like a vlog or something like that. Like I was actually just a bit nervous about it. So I started cutting up bits of paper and doing some like very rudimentary stop motion when I started, like just doing kind of craft things and moving them around the frame. And when YouTube first started, I also sought out a lot of animations. Like I was just kind of drawn to it as a medium. I think it adds an element of entertainment and whimsy to science stories. It can, and that's definitely what I've tried to do with it in my career as well.
I came to animation completely by accident. I am not myself an animator, nor probably will I ever be, but I work with a lot of animators. And I, like Sabrina, studied math and also playwriting in undergrad. And my career went from dramaturgy and theater to documentary film production to Nova, where I was producing science games and developing a love of cryptic crosswords that persists to this day. And so while fairly early on there, I got really interested in what was happening online in terms of the education space and the opportunities to be able to embrace digital media and not just replicate the classroom experience online, and thinking about what could be interesting and organic ways of doing that. And around the time, I connected with a friend who was writing scripts for TED-Ed. So TED-Ed, like everything that we produce is a collaboration between educators, which are often academics and researchers, somebody with a specific expertise, the TED-Ed production team, which has storytelling chops and a lot of experience, and animation studios all over the world. And so when I first got involved with TED-Ed, I was doing so writing. I'd never written for animation before, and it was sort of just learning as I went. And eventually I wound up there and became very fully immersed in it. And then have learned over the years how that works. And to be clear, so what I do is I work with a team of writers and producers who are working with these academics and experts to take their ideas and the things that they are passionate about and turn it into a script for animation, and then helping that translate to the screen. And then my job basically ends when we lock scripts and goes to our fantastic production team that figures out exactly what animation studio we're working with, records the narration and everything. So we're like a slightly different model in that we have a fairly large production team that's working on a lot of content in parallel and in collaboration. I know you guys have collaborators, but it's like a fairly big operation that we're doing at scale, and working with so many animators all over the world is part of what makes that possible.
That's great, Alex. And I mean, one thing that I think is important to know is, there are a bunch of students on the chat or people who just recently graduated. And if you come from a writing background, doing the sort of work that Alex is talking about, where you're writing or producing, you're working with writers and editors and animators, it is definitely a career path that a lot of people who leave programs like SHRP end up doing. So even if animation may not be a thing that you necessarily want to spend time developing as a skill yourself, being involved in the world of animation is still open to you in other ways, like Alex, Alex just talked about.
I'm often looking for writers and producers, so
there you go.
Literally,
Alex up after the panel. Before we get too far down the road, I want to make sure that everyone in the audience has a sense of the type of work each of you does. So I know you each brought clips to show of your work. I would love to start with you, Sabrina, to give a little taste of the type of motion graphics and animation work you do.
Sounds good. Yeah. So for context, I'm going to be sharing a clip from a video I made where I taught the video title is I taught an AI to stand BTS, the Korean pop band. Basically, it's just a video about facial recognition and how a robot or an AI might be able to recognize faces. Breaks it down to a couple of parts. This is just focusing on that first part of what is a face? How can a machine see things? Now, I should have said those things while I was loading up the clip, but I'm bad at multitasking. I'll find it. Give me 1 second.
No, I also should say that this is just one part of a much longer video where Sabrina's on camera talking about what she's about to do. So animation is an important part of what this video does, but it is not the entire video. So I just think that's kind of an interesting thing to understand about Sabrina's work.
Yes, I agree. Okay, I'm gonna hit play on this clip. Let me know if you can't hear or see anything.
We need to split facial recognition into 3 smaller steps: finding a face, analyzing key facial features, and identifying the face from a set of known faces. Let's start off with the first step. Now, it's important to note that detecting a face isn't the same as identifying it. Right now, all we care about is finding any faces in the picture. We don't care who it is. Splitting up these tasks saves us a lot of computational energy, so we aren't analyzing every frame and pixel when it isn't needed. So how does a computer actually find a face? Well, a human face is just an object in an image, and researchers have developed a bunch of ways to identify objects. Some of the most popular ones use edge detection, since you can tell a lot about an object by its outline. Now, there are a couple of techniques that exist to detect edges, but we are going to use a histogram of oriented gradients, or an HOG. It's an algorithm that works by breaking down an image into smaller cells. It then analyzes the pixels in the cell for the most intense changes in color or light. If there are enough pixels indicating intense changes, that is a pretty good indication of an edge. The direction and intensity of those changes can be represented with a vector, or an oriented gradient. The algorithm then summarizes all of the oriented gradients in a histogram, tracking the magnitude of common angles. After doing this for every cell, we're left with a really simple numerical representation of where the biggest changes in intensity occur in the image and the direction they take on. That is how a computer can see. And if we assume that light moves across any average person's face in a similar-ish way, given the same lighting conditions and angles, then the edges that we can pull from that image and its numerical representation should be pretty similar as well. So, if we have a machine that's already trying to recognize the numerical representation of a face, it should then be able to detect one in an image.
I accidentally exported a way longer clip than the clip actually was. Anyway,
Oh,
that's that.
I would have just watched the full video, and I sort of lost it now. So
I know you were making faces, and I was like, I'm liking this. I don't know what you're worried about here.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but the clip actually runs for 21 minutes. Not even, it's just black screen. I messed up the export. That's my bad. It's all good. I'm a professional video maker.
Happens to us all.
It truly does happen to us all. That's beautiful though, Sabrina. I mean, it definitely conveys a lot of complicated information, but it's also just like really playful and gorgeous. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Alex, do you want to show a clip next?
yeah, okay. And so for my context, so TED Ed, like there is no style that represents TED Ed because our aesthetic is working with all different styles. Like we work in motion graphics and stop motion and hand drawn, like any animation style that exists, we've probably done some of it. The best thing to show you would probably be a sizzle reel, but I don't have that. Instead, I just chose a video I really love. And so as another point of juxtaposition, our content is 100% animated start to end. And so animation for us is everything. It is storytelling, it is context, it is scene setting, and it is explanatory. One of the things I love about the medium also is the information density that you can do with animation. Like one thing I like to say when we start a collaboration with experts who get nervous because our content's about 5 minutes long, and they're like, how can I communicate my idea in 5 minutes? And what we've found on the basis of like just how many footnotes we put into for fact checking, that the information density of a TED Ed animation is about the same, or the total information content is about the same as a typical TED talk. So just comparing the different teams at TED, what they're doing, it just communicated very differently. But like the fundamental goal with all of our pieces of content is to plant the seed of curiosity in something that you might not be familiar with, but anybody could get interested in and do it as clearly as possible. Like we embrace complexity. It's not about simplifying. It's about giving everybody an inroads. So this is a piece that we did a few years ago about the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm going to try to multitask as I do this, and we'll see if that's successful. And we did it with David Dunning, the namesake of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm just going to show you the first minute. I just really love the visuals. Yeah, it's a sense of one of many aesthetics.
Are you as good at things as you think you are? How How good are you at managing money? What about reading people's emotions? How healthy are you compared to other people you know? Are you better than average at grammar? Knowing how competent we are and how our skills stack up against other people's is more than a self-esteem boost. It helps us figure out when we can forge ahead on our own decisions and instincts, and when we need instead to seek out advice. But psychological research suggests that we're not very good at evaluating ourselves accurately. In fact, we frequently overestimate our own abilities. Researchers have a name for this phenomenon, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
So yeah, so that's an example.
Beautiful.
And I get no
So
credit
good.
for that. In fact, I get no credit for that because when we are scripting these visuals, we're not doing like a 2-column script like you might do for documentary production. We are writing the script for narration. And part of the reason for that is when we work with animation studios, we're giving them as much creative freedom as possible. It's part of the part of how, as an educational nonprofit, we're able to afford the caliber of animation that we are, is that we bring the animators in as really full collaborators. So all credit to the animation studio in this case for like the visual treatment, and our production team working with them closely to figure out how to make that work.
Something that I noticed, I'm sorry, Anna, between your two videos is you had both commented that they were longer clips, like a minute, or it was longer than you intended to show. I could have sat and watched 5 times more of that. Like as soon as the clips ended, I was like, oh, I just want a little bit more. Like I want to keep watching. So I think that's credit to like the amazing production that both of you have behind those clips.
Couldn't
Now we're
agree
gonna
more.
watch 10 hours of your videos. Let's go.
TED Ed binge.
By the way, the animation studio in question is called Wednesday Studio, and for credit where credit is due. But yeah, totally agreed. Yes, but please show us a very long clip, Vanessa.
Yeah, Vanessa did, Vanessa's clip is a little different because Vanessa does so many different types of animation in her work. She put together a little sizzle reel of sort of 3 different types of animation that she does. Sorry, I'm still in your intro, Vanessa. You should go for
No,
it.
that's fine. I realized before that when I spoke, I didn't give the best overview of what I do. So I have a YouTube channel that's called Braincraft. I have had that for 8 years. For 5 of those years, it was a web series with PBS. So the videos that I'm going to show you, 2 of those have been produced with PBS. One of them had grant funding as well. I'm now fully independent, and throughout my career, I have worked on various TV shows and documentaries and different types of content. I am almost the opposite of Alex and Sabrina, where I don't really have a visual style. Like I just have every type of animation on my YouTube channel with different projects that I've worked on. And the reason for that is that sometimes I've had decent funding, either through a broadcaster or a grant, and then sometimes I have no funding at all. And I'm working as a freelancer or doing science research like I'm doing now, and I'm just doing my YouTube channel on the side. So the point of showing you all of these examples is to get an idea of what different animation can look like for different mediums and with different budgets. So I too will attempt to multitask as I set up my screen share. The 3 videos that I'm showing you, one of them is a short video on telomeres, which you'll find out what they are, but basically it's like a biology animation. The second one is from a documentary that I did on our attention and how technology may or may not fragment that. And the third one is a communications video that I did. I am so bad at multitasking that I actually didn't set up my screen properly while I was saying that. So just give me a second to.
It's hard.
Fun fact, there's no such thing as multitasking. It's a myth.
Inside our cells, genes are arranged on chromosomes, ladders of DNA that hold instructions for the building blocks that built you. To keep the cell from thinking chromosome ends are broken DNA, they have special caps called telomeres. kinda like the plastic tip at the end of your shoelaces. Each time your DNA is copied and a cell divides, the telomeres get shorter until a cell either dies or stops dividing forever. But tetrahymena can divide forever. Their telomere caps don't wear down. By watching these tiny creatures grow, Liz Blackburn and Carol Greider discovered telomerase, an enzyme that adds new DNA to the ends of telomeres. Liz and Carol's discovery of telomerase was so groundbreaking, they won a Nobel Prize.
You receive millions and trillions of bits of information from the external world at any moment, but you only experience what you attend to. One of your most amazing skills is called attentional control. It's the capacity to choose what we ignore and what we pay attention to, and devote cognitive resources to processing it.
Though this email exclamation point trend on TikTok isn't surprising, your age is actually related to how punctuation influences your perception of messages. A 2018 study looked at differences in how people born before 1985 interpret messages compared to those born in 1985 or later. Participants read an exchange where some of the replies contained full stops, while others had the same text but no full stops. Just take a final moment to rate these two messages. Is one more positive? Is one more negative? Or are they about the same? The study participants rated the replies on how positive or negative they thought they were. And for those born before 1985, it didn't seem to matter whether the reply had a full stop or not. Younger people, on the other hand, rated messages with full stops as more negative than those without. For sure, this is subtle, but it's still really important for school or workplace dynamics if younger people are interpreting messages from their professors or colleagues or bosses as more negative than they were intended. Something that I didn't set up very well were those title cards were so fast. And what they were saying was that the extremely quick graphics that you saw in the last clip, I actually did in Canva in about an hour. The first animation that was a stop motion the whole video took me about 3 weeks to animate of full-time work. And the one in the middle was actually commissioned and we used an external animator. So I really just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of things that you can do. Obviously the aims were different in those, like in the first couple, the animation was more for entertainment value, like I was trying to add whimsy to technical information or illustrate what we can't see. But in the last example, it was really just for visual interest. So I'm not a talking head on screen for too long. We could have a debate now about whether that was actually animation or not, because it was mostly just motion graphics and emojis and GIFs and stuff like that. Except I think that if you have no budget and you're on a deadline, there are options like Canva that enable you to use some kind of imagery in your storytelling.
That's awesome, Vanessa. I mean, I want to talk a lot more about how we work on a budget. There's actually a question here from somebody in the chat asking, you know, how when you have limited resources, do you sort of allocate animation as part of creating videos? And so I am curious about that in a few different ways. First of all, like for both Sabrina and Vanessa, when do you use animation versus not use animation? When is it a device that you think really adds to your storytelling and it's something you want to invest in when you do have sort of like limited resources? Animation is expensive. And when do you decide to go with talking to camera or just some other type of video storytelling device?
Yeah, I think in the case where I would commission someone else to make that animation, just to give you an example, I made 12 videos on my YouTube channel last year, and for one of them, I paid an animator to make animations. And in that case, it was really additive to the story. It was something that I didn't have the skills to do myself in Canva. It would have taken me a very, very long time, like weeks, to do in Premiere Pro or other software. So it was just easier to hire an animator for that. As I mentioned, like to I would use it in a way where I couldn't communicate that image through speaking to the camera, and it was really to do something that you can't see. Just to add to that, there are many different budgets and many different types of animations that you can get. Like animation really has a sliding scale from the skill of the animator to, is it 2D, is it 3D, is it graphics, and such. So there's a pretty big range in terms of budgets, and what you can get for that.
Yeah, and for me, we choose what to animate based off of like this is a weird way to frame it, but is it the cheapest option to maintain the audience's attention? Because there are certain things that you want to communicate that you can do it with a camera, with a person talking, and it can be incredible, but it could be too difficult to film. You might not have the idea. It's just going to be a lot more work, and animation unlocks so many doors because it's just pictures you could generate. You could go to outer space if you want with animation, right? So that is sometimes animation is the only way that you can really clearly communicate that idea. Now, I forgot the second part of it. For budgeting wise, I think that's something that you really need to think about in terms of your script. Like you need to anticipate the animation and you need to learn how to like cut your losses where maybe the animation can't be as long. It forces you to be a little bit more concise and a little bit clearer in how you write, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then, like Vanessa was saying, it's about like choosing an animation style that fits your budget, and maybe like Alex and TED working with animators who really believe in your mission and in exchange for creative freedom might be willing to take a bit of a pay cut.
How is writing for animation different than writing for other types of video production, or even writing an article, just a completely different medium altogether?
It really impacts where you put the noun in a sentence, because sometimes
give an example.
So I was doing a video and I think I was trying to create a list of things that impact your ability to focus. And then I was just writing it out. And it was working well. And then when it came time for animation, I put the list at the end. And then I was like, people will not be able to comprehend this list of things impacting your focus if they're on screen for like the half second it takes for the sentence to finish. And so we needed to re-record the audio and rejig the whole order of things. Think about where you place your nouns.
That's such a good point. It's really true. Like thinking about the pacing of a sentence when you have a complicated visual, I mean, it does really change. It changes your whole pacing for sure. Vanessa and Alex, what's sort of your approach to writing for animation versus other media, or even just writing to camera in your case, Vanessa?
In my case, the writing for animation is just very concise, and I really try to use the fewest amount of words possible to really let the images shine. In some cases, when I'm just speaking to camera, like it can be very long, like sentences, there's a lot of jokes in there, it's very quite conversational, but you just don't have that kind of time in animation. So I like to keep it short, but also just find a way to communicate things visually rather than using too many words.
Yeah, my answer is very similar to that, like animation can do so many things that one of the toughest things as a writer, especially if you're coming from print, is letting animation do those things. Like it really requires you to, and especially, I mean, I come from the context where, and this is true across the board, animation is time consuming and expensive too. So you're constrained by those limitations to be able to force you to be concise for that reason. But also like to what both of you were saying, it will be more effective to let animation be doing some of this, as much of the storytelling as it can be doing, and letting the audience also make the connections between the two, rather than making it sort of balloon in terms of what you're doing in the narration. I also, for me, like my experience was more in the documentary world before writing for animation, and that's very specific in that like there we were to a large extent starting from, okay, these are the visuals that we have. How do we tell a story with that, or what, where do we need to fill in the gaps? And then sometimes animation will come for, like for a snow leopard film to show the migratory pattern of the snow leopard, but it really was, camera first. With animation, it's such an exercise in blank slate storytelling that you can really make it do whatever you want. And that's one of the things I love about this medium is it gives us a ton of creative freedom to really tell lots of different types of stories, just bounded by our own imaginations and what works well with animation.
Yeah, that I totally agree. I always used to joke that the whole reason that I learned how to animate is because I was just like a digital producer at Nova, and Nova didn't want to send me to like Hawaii to film the weird fish that I wanted to film. So I needed some solution to figure out how to do that on my own. And animation was just my route to figuring it out. And it opened up a whole world of possibilities. And storytelling.
But I will say that Anna is also very creative, and when she was at Nova, every time I would go to her house or office, she would be painting something, and she'd be like, "Oh, I'm just painting this fish," and then she would cut it out and take a photo of it and kind of use that to animate. And every other week, Anna was going to Party City to buy craft supplies for something that she was making. So I think that that's an important lesson in animation as well, that some people had asked about budgets, and if you don't have a budget but you have a very creative, nimble producer, it is possible to find solutions like we have done in our work as well.
I have given Party City way too much of my money over the years.
VIP club.
Yeah, exactly. Alex, you were talking about, well, actually all of you were sort of talking about the role that animation can play in what you do. And it's interesting because animation can be a great tool to convey new information, or it can be a tool to add both like literal color and emotional color to a story, kind of taking the place of almost like the adjectives that you would add to a sentence if you were writing a print piece. And I'm curious if there's sort of like moments while you're scripting or while you're sort of storyboarding, if you storyboard, where you're sort of deciding this is a moment when the animation is doing, it's serving an informational role versus sort of like an emotional role, and the different approaches you take when you're trying to convey information versus creating a visual metaphor or something like that.
Vanessa, I saw you unmuted first. You can go for it if you want.
I have not been muted the whole time. I was just going to say year 3 of the pandemic, and we still can't overcome these Zoom pauses.
I know.
You do the popcorn pass thing. Anyway, I could speak to this a little bit. For Answer in Progress, our format is very much like we ask this big question, and then we have some sort of explanation that provides the audience with a primer that we can use for an application of like the lessons that we've learned. So for example, with my AI standing BTS, recognizing all of their faces, I needed to tell the audience, how does a computer do this? Now let's do it together. So that is very much what I have in mind. Now, the specific components that we select for that explanation is very much part of like this holistic approach of what is the whole video and what information, what is the minimum amount of information, because animation is expensive and difficult, that we can give the audience. So it really is important to start off with this whole view if you want to be using your resources like as best as you can.
Something that I'll add, just kind of thinking about your question, Anna. So I have a master's degree in science communication, which I'm definitely not saying as a flex because I'm actually not sure it was worth my time. Because science communication theory and practice is actually just so different. But one thing that you learn about a lot in science communication theory is something called the, oh my God, I've just had a complete meltdown. I can't remember. Anna, what am I trying to say? It's the model. It starts with a D. It's the someone Google it. Anyway, it's the model. It's the model, which is basically just an information dump. I was going to say deficit model. Thank you. Someone put it in there. So you learn a lot about the deficit model, which is where you just give people a lot of facts, and the science information that they receive is basically like a Wikipedia article. And how you can try to get around that is by adding emotional valence. So by adding jokes and personal perspective and inserting emotion into your piece whenever you can. Now, it's really hard in video to break, and especially doing explainer videos, to break free of the deficit model, because we're essentially communicating information, right? And videos need information to be able to live on YouTube. So when I think about animation, it's a really good opportunity for me to add little bits of emotion, whether they, as you said, Anna, they're like literal color or images, but I try to use it for a lot of jokes or to set the tone of a piece, or just kind of to have like a little dot on my eye or a little bit of flair or something like that to bring more emotion into the piece, so it's not in this deficit model of just facts and information, because that is extremely easy to do when you start working out in video, where you're like, okay, here are all the facts that I need to communicate, and I'm just going to speak to the camera reciting them.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Like, one of the things in the clip that Alex, oh, by the way, I should say, I got a lot out of my master's degree, just so Dan doesn't kill me. I got a ton out of my master's degree.
But you did a master's degree in science journalism, not in like science communication theory. It's like basically social science theory. Okay. Yeah, very different.
One thing I was going to say though is, Alex, in that clip that you showed us, one of my favorite parts was the little visual metaphor of like the lab bench with the balloon inflating, and then you're sort of realizing that it's you know, this like a person's sort of ego inflating, and it was such a smart way to use animation and to bring in the idea that we're about to talk about, the science of this idea. Anyway, I just really liked that. But that's not the only way that TED uses animation. You also, you know, talk about really complicated concepts as well, particularly in some of the riddles that I've seen where there's a lot of math in there. So I'm curious about your approach to this too.
Yeah, so it's a tough question for me to answer just because our content varies so much. So I was sort of thinking about it, like, because we cover everything under the sun, the challenges for a different piece will be different. So like we have a mythology mythology series, excuse me, where we're telling, you know, celebrating global cultures through the mythology of specific regions and cultures. And in those, there's almost never a moment where we say like, okay, this is what it has to show. It's sort of a wide open playing field where we're starting from pretty much always a character-driven narrative. I will say the common thread across the board, even when it is a pretty technical math or physics piece, is it like I consider us narrative first, in that, and I count things like the narrative of asking a really interesting question and unpacking it to its logical conclusion, as you're talking about, Sabrina, like being able to, like, that is a journey and an arc. And so even in those cases where we're getting pretty into the weeds of a thing, I would say that the technical visuals are in service to something else that is more about the narrative emotional journey, just because that is so much more engaging. And like to what I was saying earlier, like this is what you can do through digital media. Like this is what largely this medium is optimized for, is to engage people in a way that is not purely about information content. So that being said, so we have like math pieces like the riddle series, where those do often require pretty, like, you know, a lot of it. In that case, the emotional journey is giving people something to bash their heads against, and actually like encouraging people to pause, which I think is relatively unusual, at least on YouTube, and think about it and try to solve it yourself, and then giving you an explanation where no matter where you got to in the problem, you can follow the explanation. And so in cases like those, we're really careful to, like I work very closely with the animation studios in those cases to make sure that it's becoming as visually intuitive as possible. And but even within that, there is a lot of variants where sometimes it is very like the best thing to do is very see and say, where the narration spells something out and the visuals are reinforcing that directly. Other times the best thing to do is to have the two have basically counter narratives, or the narration is being very literal and the visuals are introducing the visual metaphor. I haven't figured out a way to generalize it to a rule of thumb. But it is something that, like, part of the artistry, I think, of crafting the scripts and thinking about these pieces is setting it up for success in that regard, and then working with the animators to kind of realize the best version that it can be of that. So like when we did one on Einstein's twin paradox, where one person jets off to space near the speed of light, comes back to Earth, the other stays on Earth, and by the end, are they the same age or different ages? And like that one required, when we were developing it with the educator, with the expert, we kind of came with is there a good visual way to represent this? And the best possible visual way we landed on was through a graph. And part of what animation is able to do that the graph was not is to be able to make that, to illustrate it through motion. But in that case, unpack, like telling you how to understand this graph and how to read it, and then how the visuals are reinforcing the idea and telling you the answer was the best possible thing we could do. In another one on Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is basically that Gödel discovered that there are mathematical statements that are provably unprovable. So previously it was thought that everything was either provably true or provably false. He found the provably unprovable, which is this kind of hole in the heart of mathematics that like is either very frustrating or like beautiful, the way no matter depending on how you think of it. And in that piece, the more useful thing to do is establishing the intuition for what this means, and like what building, so axiomatic mathematics is about building ideas on top of ideas. And so what do you do when there are these holes that you can never fill? And so in that case, the visual metaphor of, and we did it with building blocks rather than saying like, here is an axiom, here is a corollary, et cetera. It was a better way of unpacking the mathematics than the really literal approach.
That's really interesting, Alex. I wouldn't have thought of it that way. That's so cool. Oh, Sabrina.
Add one last thing about adding emotion to a piece. As important as animation is, like, it is a shocker how big just music, how much music can carry a piece. Like, you could have very simple animations, just a beautiful track in the background, tears, weeping, where's your Oscar?
It's true. One of the things that actually all four of us chatted the other day, and one of the things that we were talking about is how sometimes like the simplest animation is enough. Like, you don't need to have like giant production quality to tell a story really well. And sometimes it's about just like the music or the humor of the animation that you have, or the simplicity of your writing. And especially if you're on a budget, there are these videos is a complex medium. There's a lot you can add to a video to bring a story to life, and animation is just one part of that.
Yeah, you throw eyes on a pie and suddenly you have this character that engages your interest, like three blue, one brown.
Right.
Like, uses a lot of very simple rudimentary animation that creates a visual aesthetic, and also something that engages you beyond just the mathematics on the page. He also does great mathematical modeling, but like, yeah, that there are solutions that do not require world-class animators that can create this a deep level of engagement. It's just like, I took a puppetry class in college, and like it's very simple to bring anything to life, like eyes and breath. And as soon as you do that, you have a living thing. And like, I guess it's one of the weird things about being a human, that we can like very freely imbue things with life that way. But in this medium, that's something that you have a lot of leeway to do.
For sure. Well, so it is a medium where you have a lot of leeway to do anything. However, we're also making educational or factual content. And so when you're adding animations, that does add another level of complexity. It adds another space for you to add inaccuracies to your piece. I'm curious how each of you approach fact checking and making sure your animations are accurate.
Yeah, I can jump in there. For specific projects, I have actually had a fact checker fact check the animation. And these are people who fact check print stories, but they have also worked just on the video. So they'll watch it and we'll use something called Frame.io. And there's plenty of other collaborative software like that, but where they can actually pause the frame and draw on it with their cursor if there are any issues. And we'll go back to the animator and get them to edit it. And we do that sometimes with experts as well when we don't use fact checkers. I don't do it for every piece, but it is definitely important when you have something that is quite complex to make sure that you're getting it right.
Yeah, I was going to say Frame.io, Whipster, and Vimeo are all good platforms for this. Sorry, Sabrina, sorry to cut you off.
I didn't know Vimeo was on there.
Yeah.
Ooh, very spicy. One thing that I'll also add is there's like a specific person who not a specific person, but a specific specialization that people can have called visual researcher, where their job is to just know and identify, like they're specialists in fact checking, but for video or for like images. And it's incredible. I had the pleasure of working with one on a history type project that I did a while ago. And sometimes the best thing to do is just ask someone who knows their stuff.
History can be so hard. Maps have so many, they're a minefield because they change so much. There's contested things. We try to have like two touches for everything. One, we have the experts who are working on the script. And so in addition to constantly asking them, like, is this accurate as we're revising? And scripts go through a lot of iterations, so it's very necessary. We have them also reviewing the work in progress cuts. Sometimes an animatic or storyboard, it sort of depends when there is enough of the factual content in there. So they're reviewing it and telling us if we got things wrong and weighing in. And then we have TED has fact checkers and we also run everything through fact checking, address any flags that come up. And then often the visuals, we also run by them when we want a second layer, especially when it comes to things like maps, of somebody looking really deeply into it and making sure we're getting it right.
One thing I'll also add is one thing we do at Answer in Progress is we burn in citations. Whenever we are making a reference to anything that we've researched, it's on the screen, because something that I personally found frustrating is sometimes I'm like, where did you get this graph? I want to double check that this graph is saying what you're saying it's saying. And then they don't have citations anywhere. How have we allowed this to happen? I don't know. But then I just put in citations. Gosh, bring it back.
Yeah, I remember going to a panel many years ago. Vanessa, you might have been there. Sabrina, you might have been there too at VidCon a bunch of years ago, where somebody was talking about where their information comes from, and they didn't use citations or captions or anything like that. And then they said, oh, I just think the audience should be able to fact check this themselves. And I was like, no, please, at least put something in the description box. Yeah, anyway, bad moments in science journalism history. One question that Anton put in the chat that is a great one is, how do you keep animations interesting? I think this is a problem that a lot of people struggle with, particularly for complex ideas. Often an idea can be can benefit from a visual, but how do you make sure that you're not just staying on the visual forever and you're keeping it visually interesting, that the eye doesn't just start to wander?
I could add to this. I love keeping animation interesting, but not difficult to animate, because that takes up a lot of time. One thing that's really worth looking into is like these 12 principles of animation. If you Google it, you'll get a list, but it's more about keeping your animation intentional and always moving, but not busy. So for example, if you need a visual on the screen for a while, have a little bit of a slow zoom, have some little figures on the slide moving on the sides, moving slowly. Like you could cheat your way into having people feel like, oh, there's action happening on the screen for very little effort. But yeah, I think it's just really smoothly thinking about your transitions and also the core features of your design. Have you thought about your color palette? Is it composed in a way that is clear, but also just like, yeah, if that was a poster, I'd get that. Like, the easier you make it on somebody's eyes, the easier it is to keep them there.
Yeah, I will just add to that and say that sometimes I feel like I keep my images on screen for too long and that they're too static, but I do that at times where I'm delivering quite a lot of information over the voiceover. So I really try, even using words sometimes, to just emphasize a sentence that I'm speaking, but having the words wiggle and kind of do something interesting. I do that a lot. I always try just to use myself as a test audience to watch things back. Sometimes I put them on my TV and sit down and watch as well, just to make sure that they're not actually moving too quickly, because sometimes that can be more distracting.
I think it also comes down to writing. Like, sometimes when we result in something that ends up on a static shot for a while, I think it's become apparent because we've motivated that. Like, we've motivated something where we're just living in a shot that doesn't have movement, that doesn't have like something happening with character. And so, it comes back to the intentionality there of like, when you're writing for it, are you optimizing for this, or like, are you writing something that is better served in print or by other means?
Great. We have a few questions in the chat that I think we should get to. Sorry. So Aaron says, with animation granting material a sense of whimsy and play, do you see animated informational content being more accessible than other reporting?
I think it really depends on the story that you're telling in terms of having that tone. Like, a lot of the science journalism over the past few years has been about COVID, and whimsy and play aren't really appropriate as a tone for a lot of those stories. So I think that just in terms of using those, it definitely depends on the story that you're telling, but I think that it can add another layer of accessibility when it's appropriate.
I think so. We do. I mean, I think a lot of our animation is whimsical. I think there's a lot that also is not whimsical. Like, I don't think that's an inherent aspect necessarily of animation, though it's definitely an association, a widespread association with it. But oh shoot, what was I going to say? Oh, in terms of accessibility, I think the thing that one of the things about it that is so wonderful about the medium is that it can be completely divorced of culture and setting. And like, for us, we're very, very deliberate about who we depict in characters. And like, sometimes they won't be human figures, but if they are scientists, like working against active stereotypes. And we often will come back to animators with notes of like, okay, can we make these scientists female, or, can they be people of color? Like, it's interesting also seeing sometimes where people's minds default to. But so we have and I imagine this is true of the two of you as well, but I'm curious, but like, we have a very worldwide audience. And so the fact that people from around the world are engaging with it, I think answers that question as well, both in terms of like, the emotional valence of the content, but also the ability to make it a very inclusive space.
Agreed. If my nodding didn't let you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Agreed 3 times.
And agreed 4 times. Each of you have very different processes as you're working. I think there was a question in the chat about this too, and I've now lost it. I'm really sorry to whoever asked this question. Demily. It's a question about sort of your process for plotting out visuals. So, okay, yeah. So when you're writing scripts that are going to be read over animations, do you already have an idea of what you want the animations to be or what they should include? I know that each of you have a very different process of sort of how you script write and when visuals come into the process. So I'm curious, like, how each of you approach that.
Yeah, something that Alex mentioned earlier was in scripting. A lot of people have a 2-column script, which is something that I do. So I have one column where I have all of the words that will be delivered, whether it be voiceover or to camera. And then I have another column that has all of the visuals in it. And quite often I drop GIFs and images and do little doodles, and that all goes in the visual column, as well as perhaps B-roll or other visuals that you'll see. So in terms of my process, I start with all of the words and then I'll read through it and kind of figure out whether it makes the most sense for the audience to see a visual, and I might rewrite that slightly for animation, and I'll break that out and kind of do a small little storyboard.
Yeah, on top of that, I do the same thing. And on top of it, I also include like lists of things that I think are worthwhile or relevant to the piece. So for example, we did a thing about Al-Jazri, this inventor from the golden age of Islam, and we wanted to showcase all of his inventions, but it was going to be not entertaining for us to list all of his inventions. So we simply just said, get his inventions on the screen somehow during this bit of the animation. Here's a list of them. It's also a good opportunity for when you are choosing to hone in on one thing, even though it might not be the overall sphere. So for example, thinking about sustainable solutions in the world, right? There might be a bunch of different options, but we're choosing to focus on this specific one. Having on screen the hammering it in that like, this is just one of many options, and making sure that's included in the visual is a good way to show and not just say stuff.
Yeah, and again, I'm in the weird place of not dictate. So like Vanessa, it was a adjustment to me to write for animation without doing 2-column script, because, and I think the very first draft of when I was volunteering for TED I did write as a 2-column script, and they were like, no, we don't want this. But yeah, I just have to live in the place of both setting animation up to do something in continuity. And at this point, it's something that is operating largely at the level of intuition. It's sort of like the learned skill of doing this 1,000 times over, while not dictating visuals. So we'll often do, there are times where we'll say, like, there's specific information we want to get in, like you're saying, Sabrina, like that, here's what we like want to communicate visually, because this is an important background or piece of information for this subject. But in terms of the overall approach, like there is something going on in my head for a piece that that shows that it is the kind of shape that will work with animation, but it is a little hard to articulate more directly.
I'm personally curious, Alex, you said before that like you give the animators a ton of freedom, and that may help keep your costs down a little bit. Is that really true? Is that really true? I mean, I'm asking for me completely. Like I always, whenever I work with an outside animator, give a 2-column script to them thinking that I'm saving them time, but am I really doing them harm by sending over a bunch of thoughts? Like, happy to not do that if I don't have to.
I don't know,
except for like the technical stuff.
Right. I don't know. It's hard to say, because I think if I worked for other outlets, I'd probably go back to 2-column scripting. I don't think that's the only reason they're working for us, but it is something that we hear a lot of satisfaction from them, and interest in. I mean, and to be frank, like they're also, there's TED's reach too, which is a big part of it, for animators that we're working with. So I wouldn't say that, I don't know, I think you could have that conversation too, if you can bring somebody on at the very beginning of the process, and like different like I think it's a mistake too to generalize animators as this, single body that are all going to feel the same thing. Some might really appreciate that, others might love the open playing field. So
I could speak to this from the perspective of somebody who has also done freelance animation. And it's kind of like, I appreciate the suggestion, just give me freedom to say no. And also, if you're going to critique something, please give me a suggestion of what you actually do want, if I'm not serving you what you want, right? It's like having that open dialogue without restricting their freedom. of what they want to
Yeah.
animate.
I mean, that latter point is being a good editor generally, I think, regardless of the medium that you're working in. If you're going to critique something, explain what the issue is and how you want them to fix it. One thing that I think is really interesting that came up the other day when the four of us were talking is that, well, I'm just going to let Alex explain something about his process and as he's thinking about videos.
Yeah, so I mentioned before that I always have sign going on in my head when I'm writing a piece. What that something isn't is an actual visualization of what the visuals will be, because I have aphantasia. I don't have a mind's eye, which I only realized relatively recently, like was something that is part of my experience and is different from other people. But it's like, and also led to a moment of being like, man, should I be working in animation? But that ship had sailed already, well, long before. But it makes it. So like one of the attributes of aphantasia, like when it's been studied, is like there are visuals happening somewhere in my mind. They aren't necessarily, but it's a lack of access to that, so that people with aphantasia can do things like rotate 3D objects in their brains and describe what it is, but without seeing it. And so and probably it's working to animators' benefit in that I am like really not in terms of our process, and that I'm really not very literally like spelling out how it works. But yeah, it's a kind of bizarre way of working. Now, when I actually realized what was going on, there are a lot of times though where I'm able to articulate or draw something out terribly, because I'm terrible at drawing, especially with math pieces, like how we can visualize something that in a way that gives visual intuition. But it's it's an interesting, I guess it's an interesting way of working.
I mean, you're not the only person who works in animation who has aphantasia. Like there's like a famous Pixar animator who has aphantasia. So it's not like a totally unheard of thing at all, but it is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think it's also why I'm drawn to, like, I could not do Sabrina and Vanessa, the things that, and Anna, like the things that you've done. Like I don't have the skills, but I also think like from an aphantagic perspective, I think I would struggle a lot to really like be able to bring visuals to bear the way that you do. But it makes me really grateful to work with like the team that we have, and like our incredible production team that is working with animators and the animators themselves. Like it's a process that I'm able to work on that in.
We have a couple questions about making animations for kids. Am I the only one of the four of us who would say they've created stuff for kids?
Yeah,
Sabrina, Vanessa?
I have not.
Oh, Sabrina, no, you did Crash Course Kids.
I did not animate that though.
You didn't animate it though. Yeah.
Very talented team at Thought Cafe. They did it. They're incredible. They work with the Crash Course people all the time. Great stuff.
Anyway, sorry to cut you off, Vanessa.
Oh, all I was saying was that I have not done animation for kids, so I think you might be the only one.
Okay, I can talk to this really quickly. So Bethany's question is, how do you keep animation, especially with characters, which is traditionally geared towards a younger audience, interesting and engaging for adults, especially when it's a serious science topic that shouldn't be taken lightly? And then we also have a question about working for kids. So do any of you make animated content for children? How is this different from your content for adults? So actually, why don't I take Lyric's question, which is about working for kids, and then we can go to the, like, how do you use animations which are geared for young people often and present them to an adult audience. So Lyric, the thing I'll say is that I don't approach making videos for kids very differently than I approach making videos for adults. The biggest differences are my vocabulary. And as a result of using much simpler language, which I think is a good thing to do in a general way, but as a result of that, of using much simpler language, it also sort of limits the scope of what I can talk about, because not what I can talk about, but how much time I'm going to have to talk about something. If I'm having to explain pretty basic concepts, then my video is just going to be a lot shorter. But I don't actually approach from an animation perspective. I don't necessarily approach things very differently than I would approach them for adults. It just sort of depends on the topic. But yeah, I'll just use a lot simpler language. And I guess there's some times where I'll personify characters in a way that honestly I might do for adults too, but I might just make a more sort of sympathetic seeming character than I would if I were making something specifically for adults. Okay, and I'm sorry, I've mixed these two questions that I'm realizing are actually two very different questions. So Bethany's question is, how do you keep animation, which is traditionally geared towards younger audiences, engaging for adults, especially when it's a serious topic?
I'd say it mainly comes down to the design. Like, there's, say what you will, there are some serious adult animations out there. Not all of character animation is for children. The easiest way I'd put it down to is color palettes. Like for younger audiences, it's a little bit brighter, it's a little bit poppier. And if you want to very quickly communicate, like, this is for adults, this is boring, not boring, sorry, wrong word, but still a little bit duller, you could use more muted colors, a more mature color palette, and it might be enough for you.
Yeah, I think to some extent it's like generational in that I think the fewer and fewer people today are really considering like animation inherently a kid's medium. And there are times where I'm speaking to an expert and have to sort of explain like, oh, like, you know, it's not a cartoon in the way that you're thinking. It's like using visual, like illustrated visuals to unpack something. And so, I mean, our audience includes a lot of adults, and like there are times where we, like to Sabrina's points, there are choices you can make that will translate as younger and kiddier, and just like understanding those and being deliberate about how you approach those things can make it a very like age diverse medium and effective medium for people of all ages.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is like to Sabrina's point, I think there's certain visual styles that are so like tied to what we think of as like kids animation. But I also think that in the same way as like kids understand a lot more than we often give them credit for, like I think they also can be open to a variety of animation styles that we that adults would be interested in too. So I wouldn't say that you have to use a particular style for a kid. It might be more recognizable to a kid, but it also might be the thing that makes them go, oh my God, like this opened my eyes up to art in a different way or something like that. You know, there's plenty of different ways that you know, kids are going to gravitate towards different types of animation, just like adults gravitate towards different types of animation.
Yeah, I will echo what everyone has said here, but I will also add that with kids, the age that you target for is quite often a lot older than the kids that are watching it. Like when kids are 9 or 10, they're already watching YouTube for adults, like they're done with kids animation. So if you really set a visual style for a kids animation and you're targeting like, you know, 7 or 8 year olds, by the time the kids are that age, they're going to have moved on. So I think that there are less boundaries with that now than there have been in the past.
That's a really good point too, Vanessa. We're basically out of time, but I want to end on one question, which is, what advice would you give to people who are starting out in animation or in Alex's case, in the world of video production where you're working with animators? That could include like tips that were helpful to you as you were starting out, tutorials you did, software that you think is useful, kind of anything that you found really helpful as you were beginning in this path.
I have some tips, but I also have a small anecdote that I promise has a tip at the end, if it's okay, if I can start off with that. Basically, to start with the educational type stuff, like you can truly learn anything. Like I spent a summer dedicated to learning After Effects and motion graphics and spent a ton of time in those programs and got there mostly by watching YouTube videos. It really helps when you're learning to actually be creating videos as well, rather than doing it for the sake of it, because then you have real problems that you're trying to solve for and watching videos about very specific things. So download software, use your computer, watch YouTube, and the world is quite honestly your oyster. The other thing that I'll say, which is more I guess theoretical in terms of advice. So I have worked on TV and documentaries with producers who are more specific to that line of work. And I've noticed a distinction in the way that they think compared to the way that we think in web video. And when I say we, I mean, I think most of the people on this panel are people who have a science or journalism background, and TV producers think picture first. So when I have worked with them, they're always saying, well, Vanessa, what's on screen? What can you communicate through the image? What's the sequence of images that the audience will see? And they often write scripts that are more shot lists or descriptions of the visuals. Whereas what we do is really driven by the information, and you have a journalism background, like you really want to have that written story. So when you write a script, you have all of these words and you're often trying to find visuals to match up to them. And I'm that person as well. But what I would challenge all of you to do, that I try to do occasionally, but I'm not really good at doing it all of the time, is to think about the images and the sequence of images first. Like, what actually do you want the piece to look like? What do you want the audience to see? Like, visualize those and sketch them out. For example, if you produced a video that was a couple of minutes long, but it only had 50 words in it, and you had to communicate the rest of the thing just with images and music, what would that look like for you? It's a really hard activity to actually sit down and imagine something like that, but I think it's a really fun challenge as well.
Cool. The silences. Oh God. Anyway, I'd have two pieces of advice depending on which person you are. So if you are a journalist or somebody in science communication who is looking to add something to your visuals, maybe you don't need animation at all, right? Maybe you just need a little bit of shot variety. Maybe you can actually just get away with printing out something, doing an overhead shot, so that's pointing the camera directly down at a piece of paper, and then annotating it. Like, animation is very powerful, but it is not the only option you have. There are other things that are a little bit easier. There, if you just have a camera, some lights, or the sun, you could get away with it. So there's that. The sun is our biggest light, isn't it? So that is if you are just looking to spice up your visuals. If you are actually interested in animation, I think that I'll just be echoing what Vanessa said, where think about the design first. Think about the design principles, because from there, if you have these pre-existing compositions, it's just a matter of getting from one thing to another, rather than like this overwhelming journey of just like, what is this animated story? We're not Pixar directors. We can just, it's like a slideshow, but with a little bit more jazz. And I would recommend 12 principles of design, 12 principles of animation, really great, really simple things that you could add to your animation that can like really up the quality without like taking a lot of effort. And then checking out Jake Bartlett on Instagram and Ben Marriott on YouTube, two people who are like really great instructors on motion design that are very beginner friendly, but can level up your animation very quickly. I'll link to them in the chat. I'm going to stop talking now, but yeah, that's my advice.
Thanks, Sabrina. Alex?
I feel like I don't have much to add. Like, I think your answers were great. Like, you know, based on my own experience, I think like first understanding the medium as much as you can. And I'm thinking like specifically like, how do you start to craft a piece starting from the writing? But like take some time like consuming animation. and see, like, try to understand what's working, and then just try it for yourself. Like, try to write for it. Try to storyboard. You know, if you can storyboard, like, that is often the first step. Yeah, I think it, like, for me at least, it was a very learn by doing kind of thing to figure out how to embrace the medium.
If I can add one thing, I know I'm not a panelist, but one thing that I found when I first started was I watched a ton of YouTube videos. I did everything that everyone here was saying. I set like little goals for myself. I made little projects to just start trying stuff out. But first of all, like, sometimes taking a class is helpful, but I would very much recommend, if you're going to take a class, to familiarize yourself with whatever skill or software you're trying to learn first. So if, for example, you're wanting to learn how to do motion graphics in After Effects, before you jump into a class, do some online tutorials, set yourself a goal of a little project and do that first, because taking a class before you've done that can be just exceedingly overwhelming. I learned that the hard way, taking an After Effects class before I'd ever even really opened After Effects. And then somebody had put a really great comment in the chat that has now disappeared, which is like, do you watch other people's animations? How do you, like, not let that inform what you do? Let it inform what you do. Like, watch other people's animations, see what you like, and then try to set a little goal for yourself to try to, like, approximate what somebody you admire has done. Because first of all, you're never going to do it. It's not going to happen. Like, it's going to take you years to figure out how to mimic somebody else's animation style. And in the process, you'll learn a ton about how to animate. And you'll also start to develop your own style. You'll see what works for you, and the ways in which you fail in that pursuit are going to lead to your own visual style. Okay, spiel over.
Sorry, Anna, the reason that question disappeared was because I answered it in text. I typed out an answer that was basically the same as what you just said.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm so glad. Excellent. All right, we've gone over time. I'm really sorry, everyone. But this was so lovely. Sabrina, Alex, and Vanessa, thank you all for joining us tonight. This was just a delight.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you, Dan, for putting this on as well.
Thank you,
you're
Dan.
so welcome.
Thank you.
And Agnes Chung, I'm so sorry for putting you on screen here. I didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that.
Hi, Agnes.
I'm so grateful to all of you all, including Agnes, for doing this. And I'm full of deep thoughts now about how I should incorporate animation into our curriculum, because it just feels more doable now than it did 90 minutes ago. So very, very grateful to you guys. And just a reminder to everyone, this discussion will be on screen, on archive at journalism.nyu.edu/KC, along with all the other Kavli conversations. This one should be up at some point tomorrow. And keep watching this space, because we will have more Kavli conversations. The next one will be on Zoom, but after that, if the virus lets us, we're going to be in person, hopefully for a long time after that. So thank you all very much. Thank you so much to Alex and Vanessa and Sabrina and Anna. And we will see you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.